go.
Welcome to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill on 710 WOR.
Welcome. I'm Jeffrey Hill, your host right here on 710 WOR Radio in New York City. With me is my producer, Anthony Filippio, also known as The Flips.
Did you watch that All-Star game?
I did watch the game.
I liked it a lot.
Pretty exciting. You know what I liked about it?
What?
Number of Knicks players playing.
I knew he was going to say that. I felt it.
For those of you who can't see, Anthony is wearing his Knicks hat.
Always.
I think in honor of the fact that the Knicks are having another big year.
I don't care how crappy they are.
I thought the slam dunk competition was the secret.
It was really good.
Pretty intense.
That
right?
and the 3-point contest. They're always usually the best every year.
Yeah. The side of the backboard, one arm.
This is actually the first slam dunk contest that was good in like years.
I would agree. They got pretty serious about it this year. All right. Also, we have Jay Contessa joining us throughout the show. As you all know, Jay is a partner and head of CB Delivery's Ambassador business, a brand that was launched on this show about 3 weeks ago. Hey, Jay, how are you?
I'm great, Jeff. How are you?
All right, good to see you.
Likewise.
All right, we're available right here every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. on 710 WOR Radio in New York City. Then the show becomes available as a podcast on the iHeartRadio app, iTunes, and Spotify. Just search NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill. We're also shooting the show live for you YouTube users, so take a look at us on YouTube. That can be found at NYCBD Official. All right, let's tell the folks about the 4 segments of the show. The first segment is called Cannabis in the Tri-State Plus One, where I'll update you on key cannabis issues in all 4 states. The second segment is called Stunning and Amazing Facts, what I consider to be the most relevant issues and opportunities in the space since last week. Each segment is called a...
Jay?
Stunner.
There you go.
Nailed it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. We have a team now participating, as you can see, and so it's kind of like a choir now.
I want to go back to the YouTube thing for real quick. Let's make sure everybody's commenting because we want to know like everybody's opinions on your vests.
Okay, on the vest.
We got to get opinions on the vest.
Okay. All right. So everyone knows, because Anthony reminds everybody that I wear a different vest every show.
So comment, give us like a 1 through 5.
Okay.
Tell us what you think.
That would be good. I would enjoy that. All right, everyone, get on YouTube and give us a grade. All right, the third segment is called Today's Guest, and we're thrilled to have with us Joel Milton. I've known Joel for some time now. He was on the 10th week of our show. We're now on show number 41.
Wow.
He started a firm called Baker Technologies, which was then merged with Tilt, along with several other firms, to form a fully integrated technology and genetics business that also has dispensaries. Joel returns to the show to update us on where things stand. We're also going to use that as a springboard to get into our primary topic today, which is the issue of investing in the space. So after we get through the first segment of Cannabis in the Tri-State Plus One, we're going to spend most of our time in the stunner section and then on to Joel talking about investments, what's happening in the category, and where the opportunities might be. Lastly, we will end the show with our fourth segment called Your Messages, providing answers to the most interesting direct message we received following last week's show. We'll be back with our first segment, Cannabis in the Tri-State Plus One, right after this.
Are you waking up the day after a workout, tennis match, or even a long walk just feeling it? Introducing CBDeliveryNY.com to help you live the life you know you can. They carry superior CBD made from the highest quality hemp, grown and harvested under the strictest regulations. Their sales force, certified trainers, physical therapists, and yoga teachers, all of whom have gone through rigorous education, helping them to understand what the power of plants can do for your overall wellness. So start 2020 off right. Try one of their New Year's product bundles. Go to CBDeliveryNY.com. That's CBDeliveryNY.com to find out what the power of plants can do for you.
Welcome back to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill right here on 710 WOR Radio every Sunday at 8 a.m. Don't forget I write a blog, medium.com/@JeffreyHill2. That's medium.com/@JeffreyHill2, where you can get a little bit more detail on the issues we discuss during the show. All right, let's move to the first segment, Cannabis in the Tri-State Plus One. New York's medical marijuana program is growing, but future business opportunities hinge on adult use legalization. While New York's medical cannabis patient registry increased by more than 23,000 patients in 2019 to about 110,000, about 40,000 greater than the roughly 70,000 patients in both Massachusetts and New Jersey, growth has been slowed significantly because of various market factors leading to a low consumer participation rate. Less than 1% of New York residents have signed on as a medical marijuana patient due in part to restrictions on cannabis product forms, limited access to dispensaries, and a number of other problems. This means further marijuana industry growth in the state likely won't come without recreational cannabis legalization, a move that many industry watchers suggest could be potentially occurring based on pressure surrounding New York from other states. The Marijuana Business Factbook estimates New York's sales for 2019 was still $155 million, despite the fact that less than 1% are using, a nearly threefold increase since 2018. For perspective, California sold approximately $2.5 billion in volume last year, and the total U.S. market was roughly $12 billion, of which about two-thirds of that was adult use and one-third medicinal use. So New York, with its relatively paltry $200 million in volume, stands to accelerate quite significantly if our good friend Andrew Cuomo can get his bill passed.
Now you're doing this on purpose.
There you go. Of course I am. For those of you who haven't been listening every week, our friend Mr. Flips is not exactly the biggest Governor Cuomo fan.
Who is?
And so he likes to provide his perspective as we go. All right, early this year, Governor Cuomo restated his pledge to legalize adult use in the state in 2020. His plan to legalize recreational use did not come to fruition in 19, but his hand might be forced in 20 if neighboring states like New Jersey and Pennsylvania do legalize. All those states want to ensure they are able to capitalize on cannabis tax dollars and associated positive economic impacts. All right, Jay, you live in Connecticut but been traveling to New York your entire career. Tell me, what do you think of all this?
No, I think it's, obviously one is going to push the other, but it'd be nice if all three of them just, got started right away. I mean, the consumers out there, look at California, the statistics that you showed.
Right. It's pretty remarkable, right?
And all three of these states, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, need revenue.
Yeah, you're darn right.
People are leaving the state.
Right, absolutely. So just think about that, ladies and gentlemen. $2.5 billion being done in California. And the numbers suggest that about 75 to 80% of the market is actually done on the black market, which suggests there's another, let's say, $10 billion being done in the state, or a total of $12.5 billion, if those numbers are accurate. All right, New York ought to get some of that activity, and that certainly could help us from a tax standpoint. All right, let's move on to New Jersey. State lawmakers took steps on two bills last week that could bring protections for companies to allow those on workers' compensation to have their medical cannabis bills covered. The State Assembly Committee on Financial Institutions advanced the two bills, but the state Senate has yet to take up either. The first bill protects insurance companies and their employees from retaliation by state or local government if they engage with the marijuana-related businesses. The second would require workers' compensation and personal injury protection to cover costs associated with medical marijuana in certain circumstances. The patient must have tried at least one other type of treatment and found it to be unsuccessful before turning to marijuana. Just last month, the state's appellate division ruled that a construction company must pay the monthly $616 a former employee injured on the job spends on medicinal cannabis. The man who was injured 19 years ago and when a truck dumped cement on him had tried numerous other treatments, including opioids, on which he became dependent. The ruling noted how cannabis has proved the best treatment for the man's ongoing pain. All right, let's discuss this a little bit here, guys. So here's an example of an individual that had significant problems, tremendous pain, a dump truck, kind of dumps a bunch of cement on him. So unfortunately, he has a significant problem while working, right? The question is, will his disability payment cover his treatment? The answer is perhaps yes, as it relates to cannabis in the state of New Jersey. However, there's a caveat in the bill. And the bill says you must try at least one other type of medication or pharmaceutical product before you can move to cannabis. Yeah. Jay, you
talk about it, how backwards we are, right? Let's put you on opiates first, then we'll get to the natural ingredient, cannabis.
Right. So there's
versus starting with cannabis. If that doesn't work, then obviously look at something in the pharmaceutical range.
And for those of you who don't know this fact, there's about 7, maybe 8 states now that are recommending cannabis as a replacement for opioid use, especially among people that have become addicted to opioids. Flips, you're a lot younger than we are. How do you relate to this, right? So I know that, that the millennial community and other communities, the Generation Zers, et cetera, are kind of growing up in a very different environment that certainly Jay and I did, right?
Yeah.
Between technology on the one hand and access to drugs and cannabis certainly on the other hand. What do you think about this notion? Let's start out with just in the absolute, should cannabis be made available medicinally in all these states?
It should have been across the board, every state in the U.S.
Right. And what do you think about this notion that you have to try another product first?
Why would you give something that's addicted to someone first? Opioids.
Yeah. Pretty much the same point that Jay makes, right?
Yeah.
It is really quite remarkable, ladies and gentlemen. We're encouraging people to take an addictive opioid product. There's no question that opioids do have an impact on pain, but if we could get that impact done another way, seems to me like that would be a little bit better. All right, let's move on to Connecticut. While legislation to legalize cannabis for adult use in the state advanced in several committees last year, disagreements about certain provisions, such as how to allocate revenue, ultimately derailed those efforts. This time around, however, the General Assembly is positioned to build on those bills and craft a passable measure. That's according to State Senate President Pro Tem Martin Looney. We're visiting legalizing recreational cannabis because we see that most of our neighboring states have already done so or want to do so, Looney told Connecticut Insider earlier this month. We clearly need additional revenue, and anecdotally, we hear about people who travel to Massachusetts to purchase it. You know, again, I find this fascinating because all the emphasis from all these governors is kind of this cross-state competition around taxes. Right? So instead of talking about the medicinal value of the space, right, that there's 70,000 patients in Massachusetts, 70,000 in New Jersey, and 110,000 in New York getting significant value from this. The conversation instead is about, hey, these guys are stealing our users.
Yeah. Not how do we help the people in Connecticut?
Right.
How do I help myself get more tax dollars?
Right.
I mean,
it's all about they're going across the state line, so heaven forbid those darn folks in the Commonwealth state are stealing my money.
Yeah.
All right. There are some who feel the legislature was only positioned to put the question of legalization to voters in the form of a proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot. This is in Connecticut, of course. A process that would mean legal sales wouldn't go online until 2024. Governor Ned Lamont, who has been having ongoing conversations with the governors of neighboring states about coordinating a regional legalization model, isn't supportive of that at all. In fact, he says, why don't we learn from Colorado, an example that the governor argued was perhaps a statement maker?
Isn't that a smart thing?
All right, so I think this is our 41st show.
Oh, my God.
And I think Flips has asked 40 times, how come we just don't follow Colorado?
Right. That's too
ridiculous.
easy.
And on 40 separate occasions, we had to answer the question, well, we're not entirely sure.
Yeah,
right?
not my idea.
Yeah.
Exactly right. All right. So Colorado's a place where you have a long history you can look at, the governor said. So why not follow their lead? Well, I think that that's probably something we can all feel good about. All right, let's move on to Massachusetts. Last week, lawmakers on several legislative committees, including the Joint Committee on Cannabis Policy, faced a deadline to kill or advance numerous proposed cannabis bills. Let's take a look at them briefly. First, the driving crackdown. Now, I'm going to mention these 4 or 5 because there are issues in every state, and let's see how Massachusetts is dealing with, and we can talk about it a little bit. Governor Charlie Baker put significant political muscle behind a proposal to crack down on cannabis-impaired driving, holding several press conferences last year to promote the plan. Suspect drivers would have lost their licenses for at least 6 months if they refused to take a biological test for marijuana. But the pressure didn't work. The legislature's Joint Judiciary Committee last week assigned the bill to study, effectively spiking it for the remainder of the current legislative session. I guess spiking means killing it, but that's an interesting political term. All right, so what do you think about that, Jay?
Yeah, it's no progress, right? Let's keep moving the ball down.
Right.
Let's find an excuse why. And again, here they sit. People are going to do it anyway, right? So why not try to help everybody?
Right. So in other words, this issue, which is one that's being fought, or addressed in Canada, is the issue of driver impairment. Are drivers impaired when on cannabis? Well, we can all answer that question, perhaps based on experience. But the experience in Canada is that driver impairment is not resulting in significantly incremental accidents. And I believe that's the issue, or that's been the data in all the other adult use states as well in the United States. All right, let's move on to cannabis cafes. the second issue that Massachusetts is wrestling with. You can see, ladies and gentlemen, that Massachusetts is further to the cutting edge. They're all the way to cannabis cafes. Other folks can't get out of their own way and just get adult use on the table.
Crazy.
The legislature's Cannabis Committee advanced a bill last week that would allow local officials to approve social consumption businesses in their cities and towns without holding a community-wide referendum. The bill will now proceed to the full legislature. All right, Flips, give us a serious answer on this one.
Yeah.
All right, should there be cannabis cafes? Essentially a cigar bar. I walk in there, a hookah bar. I walk in, I ask for sativa or my indica. I sit there, I consume my cannabis, I walk out, I drive home.
I went to a few of them in Amsterdam. They were great. It was convenient. It was easy.
Right.
You just went in there, told them what you wanted. You went in, you sat down, you drank, hung out. That was it.
Right. And the experience, I think, not only in Amsterdam, which is, many, many years ahead of what's going on in the United States, but also in other marketplaces are that, people are more likely to just be social consumers. I ask everyone the question, where would you rather have us? Would you rather have us, kind of at a bar having shots or a few martinis and then go out and drive? Or would you rather have people at a cannabis cafe, kind of doing a similar kind of consumption and then driving home? I don't know. I think I'd like the latter. All right, let's move on. A bill that would protect employees from being fired for using marijuana during their off hours remains stalled in the legislature's Judiciary Committee, which last week requested an extension of the deadline for issuing a recommendation on the measure until May 12th. All right, another question. The state, Massachusetts, is adult use. Why are the employers getting into what the employees are doing in their off hours? Once again, it's a little bit like, should we have alcohol testing in people's off hours? Right? There ought to be limits, clearly, and we're suggesting that there's a pretty significant difference between an alcohol consumer and a cannabis consumer in terms of their ability to function. But nonetheless, there comes a point where there's a limit, and that limit ought to be tested, not unlike alcohol is tested. All right, let's move on to expungement. This one I find the most interesting. While investors cash in on legal marijuana, some Massachusetts residents remain saddled with criminal records for possessing the drug when it was illegal, making it difficult to find work and housing. Said another way, several folks are still in jail because they broke the law when it was illegal, even though it's currently legal. All right, let me go to Jay on this one. This is always an interesting issue. At the time that these people were sentenced, cannabis was not adult use. Mm-hmm. Now cannabis is adult use in the entire state.
Right.
What should you do with these people that are in jail for possibly as many as 7 to 10 years?
Yeah, just like Trump did this week. He exonerated them. Right?
Exonerated them.
He had fun this week.
Yeah, but these aren't crimes. No one got hurt. No one was killed. Right? It was personal consumption. To your point, the law was the law. But,
right. And I think that should be done broadly. I think Jay's point, which he says kind of tongue in cheek, is terribly relevant. For those of you following what's going on in terms of amnesty, our president is taking several folks who I would submit committed much greater crimes than simply smoking cannabis in their living room, right? And they found a way to give them amnesty. Yet these other folks are in jail for up to 7 years in a state that has adult use.
Right.
A proposal by State Representative Tyler would have automatically expunged records of certain marijuana crimes, but the Massachusetts Judiciary Committee declined to advance it. All right, lastly, hemp and CBD. Massachusetts hemp farmers are cheering the Cannabis Committee's decision last week to recommend passage of a bill from State Rep. Mark Cusack that would fully legalize edibles containing hemp-driven cannabidiol, or CBD. The nascent industry suffered a disastrous 2019 season after state agriculture officials announced licensed hemp companies were banned from making such products because of a change to federal law. Jay, thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I'm not really sure why they would have banned it. What was the purpose of that?
Right. I think it all got swept up in the issue of vaping.
Yeah.
So the governor up there got very, very nervous about vaping and the vaping reality, and he pretty much just put a kibosh on CBD for a period of 4 months.
Yeah. And I can understand that. That was a huge issue with the vaping issue, and I think until they got their arms wrapped around who were the bad actors.
Right.
Then you move on.
No, I would agree with that, but there's a far cry difference between vaping and gummies, right?
Exactly.
Right. So So I made the point at the time that I completely concur with you, Jay, that, we got to get rid of the bad actors, right? And vaping was part of the problem.
Right.
Only the bad actors, most of which were imports, that were creating the problem in Massachusetts and other states, right? I made the suggestion, however, that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
We should throw out the bathwater, that's the bad actors that are creating a vaping problem, and keep the baby. That's CBD, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I don't know. I thought that was pretty damn funny. Nobody in the place is laughing, but I've said this 4 weeks in a row, or some number of weeks. But
I appreciate it.
Yes, right. Throw out the bathwater, keep the baby. All right, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. My thoughts on critical issues in the tri-state plus Massachusetts. When we come back, we will move on to the next segment of our show, Stunning and Amazing Facts.
Are you waking up the day after a workout, tennis match, or even a long walk just feeling it? Introducing CBDeliveryNY.com to help you live the life you know you can. They carry superior CBD made from the highest quality hemp, grown and harvested under the strictest regulations. Their sales force, certified trainers, physical therapists, and yoga teachers, all of whom have gone through rigorous education, helping them to understand what the power of plants can do for your overall wellness. So start 2020 off right. Try one of their New Year's product bundles. Go to CBDeliveryNY.com. That's CBDeliveryNY.com to find out what the power of plants can do for you.
Welcome back to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill, right here on 710 WOR Radio every Sunday. Don't forget, right after the show, we become a podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and iTunes. We're also available on all forms of social media, and we have our YouTube channel at NYCBD Official. All right, all of our stunners today are focused on investing in the space, and our guest, Joel Milton, is going to focus his comments on investing as well. So let's begin. Stunner number one, pot financing shows early sounds of a rebound. Cannabis stocks are still near all-time lows, but the amount of capital raised in the space is beginning to bounce back. From the beginning of the year through February 7th, cannabis companies have raised $1.2 billion of capital compared to about $850 million in the same period of 2019. The growing availability of debt-based financing seems to be driving the increase. Year to date, about 30% of the capital raised. All right, let's talk a bit about the ArcView Fund. They have opened a new fund from this cannabis investment and research firm called the ArcView Group. They aim to expand the financing options available to early-stage private companies. ArcView has facilitated investments since inception in 2010, so they virtually go back to the beginning of the space, helping its network of about 600 accredited investors place more than $270 million in over 200 companies. But this is their first foray into running its own fund. If you think about it, they've been virtually involved in investing in virtually every major company in the space. The ArcView Collective Fund will be led by Chief Investment Officer Jean Sullivan. Recall she was a guest on our show about 10 weeks ago. She also co-founded a tech venture called Starvest Partners, and she will be joined by Chief Executive Officer Jeffrey Finkel, who was co-founder of Odeon Capital Partners. 3 of its 6 investments so far are in its female-run companies, including CBD brand Fleur Marché, California-based Garden Society, and Altopa, which makes the Oblend botanical oil mixing device. We're going to talk a little bit later on with Joel, and we're going to get into issues like uniqueness and kind of brand-based points of difference. That can be a brand product point of difference. It could be a management-based point of difference. So the idea of a female-focused company run and managed by women certainly represents a point of difference, and ArcView has decided to invest heavily in that brand. Let's move on to our next stunner. A week filled of cannabis news ended with the departure of MedMen Enterprises, Inc. CEO Adam Bierman, who left the company after a massive restructuring and considerable reduction in its workforce. The co-founder would also relinquish his super voting shares that he and partner Andrew Maudlin awarded themselves when the company went public in order to maintain control. Bierman joins other highly visible CEOs like Canopy Growth's Bruce Linton, who was forced out by the Constellation Brands board members who had invested $4 billion in Linton's company. Terry Booth, CEO of Aurora, also stepped down, along with the elimination of nearly 500 full-time jobs. While things are very turbulent, Cannabis Growth still has a $10 billion market cap. GW Pharma, makers of Epidiolex, the only approved FDA drug in the United States, is at $3.7 billion. Kronos valuation is $2.5 billion. Aurora's is $2 billion. And Tilray's is $1.7 billion. So there's still plenty of energy in the space. All right, but let's talk about that just for a little bit, ladies and gentlemen, because we are now seeing several of the CEOs in the market that were running some of the largest companies in the space asked to leave by their boards. Jay, let me go to you on this. What do you think the primary issue is here?
Well, obviously, I think what we've learned over the last months and over the year is the cash outflow is way exceeding the sales expectations. So there's a failure here right now, and it's probably the expectation, right? Was once the legislation became on board, boy, we'd have a green light and life would be good. And here we are now in 2020 in February, and there doesn't seem to be any more green lights moving forward in some of these major states. So I think it's going to be some tough sledding here for a while for some of these companies. No,
I would agree. And I think it's the combination of that, which is the kind of the forecasting that these companies were putting out, assumed substantially greater consumption on the part of individual states as well as on an international basis. And unfortunately, some of the CEOs that basically were prominently running some of the largest companies, their expertise was much more on the kind of
they were
entrepreneurial
side.
They
were on the farming side. They were on the...
And they were entrepreneurs. They were getting these businesses started, and they weren't necessarily capable of running what quickly became a $5 billion cap business, right?
With a lot of expenses.
Right. And so that is an interesting thing, because the knee-jerk is, like Constellation, who invested $4 billion in Cannabis Growth, they take out Bruce Linton, who was an incredible entrepreneur.
Right.
They replace him with some of their own finance people. Yep. Right. And now you've got a high growth engine company being run by like a CFO kind of an individual. Correct. I'm not sure that makes a lot of sense either.
Especially in this industry where, you're not, there's nothing, everything has to be new. You have to be on the cutting edge of marketing and all the, it's going to be available, and that's not in a CFO's wheelhouse.
Yeah, exactly right. So as these companies become more mature, the financial department becomes much more relevant. Right. Obviously, we're not suggesting that there should be, unbudgeted spending. It should be highly, it should be forecast. There should be annual budget meetings, et cetera. But typically, folks that run high growth companies don't often come out of the financial space. All right. When we come back, we'll move on to the next segment of our show, today's guest. Joining us will be Joel Milton, Senior Vice President and Board Member of Tilt Holdings, who built Baker Technologies with his partner to a valuation of $250 million when they merged with Tilt prior to going public. Joel also has a lot to say about investing in the space, so come on right back.
Are you waking up the day after a workout, tennis match, or even a long walk just feeling it? Introducing CBDeliveryNY.com to help you live the life you know you can. They carry superior CBD made from the highest quality hemp, grown and harvested under the strictest regulations. Their sales force, certified trainers, physical therapists, and yoga teachers, all of whom have gone through rigorous education, helping them to understand what the power of plants can do for your overall wellness. So start 2020 off right. Try one of their New Year's product bundles. Go to CBDeliveryNY.com. That's CBDeliveryNY.com to find out what the power of plants can do for you.
Welcome back to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill, right here on 710 WOR Radio in New York City. As you all know, we're available as a podcast right after the show airs on iHeartRadio, iTunes, and Spotify. You can also watch us on YouTube, and Anthony put in the challenge about the Best Fest Award, so don't forget to do that, all right? We're also available socially on virtually all social sites at NYCBD Official. All right, let's move on to the third segment of our show, today's guest. We are thrilled to have with us Joel Milton. Joel joined us on our 10th show also, so that was a full 30 weeks ago, so we wanted to get Joel back on and see how things are going. He is Tilt Holdings Senior Vice President and a board member. Prior to Tilt, he was the Chief Executive Officer of Baker Technologies, one of the largest software companies in the cannabis industry. Welcome to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill. Joel, great to have you with us again.
Thanks so much. Great to be back.
All right. So Joel is sitting out in Denver, where I have a feeling the temperature is a little bit different. Perhaps the amount of snow on the ground is different as well. Anyway,
Sure is.
Joel, give us a little bit of a lead in just to get us going again. Tell people a bit about your background and how you got into the cannabis business, please.
Sure. So I was living in New York City after school, found myself in the startup world. Actually, that's how I met Jeffrey. And one thing led to another, and I ended up having a bit of an agency at the time with a business partner of mine. We were building technology, helping build websites and apps and other projects for people around the New York startup scene. And in 2014, right when Colorado became the first state to go recreational, someone came and suggested that we look to the cannabis industry or maybe even build them an application. One thing led to another, and that side project turned into the last 6 years of my life.
Righto. So that became Baker Technologies. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep.
All right. And just tell us what, in a nutshell, because we want to move on to Tilt, and then we're really anxious to talk to you about your thoughts on the business investment environment in kind of the for the entire category. But tell us a little bit about what Baker represented, and then let's move on to Tilt, please.
Sure. Yeah. So Baker started off really focused on e-commerce, online ordering, and quickly recognized the challenges that the industry was facing. We ended up building the first CRM, a sort of customer management platform for cannabis, loyalty, marketing automation, e-commerce, all bundled into one, providing dispensary owners the tools they needed to figure out who their customers were, what types of product they'd like to buy, and how to keep them loyal and spending money at their store.
Righto. So at the time you were doing that, CRM, customer relationship marketing, had been around a good 10 years or so among the sophisticated retail community in what I'll say the food, drug, mass convenience space. The leaders that were actually using scan data and other kinds of shopper loyalty cards to really begin to understand their shoppers and how to market to them. But the cannabis business was just getting started, really. And what was the sophistication there when you entered?
Yeah, very little. 2014 was a very, very different time. If you look at the conferences back then, the number of attendees and who they were, cannabis was primarily illegal. And so, the early retail owners were people who were familiar with the industry. They were not retail experts. They were cannabis experts. And all the tools you just mentioned, one, weren't available. Two, this was a cash-only industry, so a lot of that data collection wasn't possible, right, because there were no credit card transactions. And so there was just a lot of opportunity for working with these new cannabis retail owners to help educate them on ways to make their businesses successful. Particularly as the industry got more and more competitive, you couldn't just open a store and expect to make money. You had to operate, like a professional business.
Righto. So I was watching you guys build from just the beginning to roughly 1,200 dispensaries, which made Baker one of the largest, if not the largest, CRM capability in the space. And then you partnered up with Tilt, and Tilt brought a number of companies together. Why don't you explain that to us, please?
Yeah, so 2018, we were really, Baker had been very successful from a growth standpoint. We had raised, a couple $1 million in capital, but there wasn't a ton of private money available. We would run around Silicon Valley, and all the big VC firms still wouldn't write Series A, Series B checks for cannabis companies. At the time, the Canadian markets were white hot. We had the big boys like Canopy and everyone else, at very, very large valuations. And there was a rush to the CSE, this previously, mostly unheard of exchange that, was a little bit speculative and, had a big following in sort of the oil and gas space. But they would allow cannabis where, NASDAQ and NYSE and even the TSX wouldn't.
When you say CSE, you mean the Canadian Stock Exchange?
Yeah, Canadian Securities Exchange, exactly.
Right. And so your point was that Canada got way ahead of the rest of the marketplace in terms of taking companies public, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Right.
So there was a number of U.S. operating companies that were unable to trade on, a major exchange like the NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange or even the, Toronto Stock Exchange. And so the CSE became the home for a number of companies in 2018.
Righto. Okay, so then tell us how you connected up with Tilt, who also identified several other businesses prior to going public.
Yeah, so the thought was that was a way for companies to raise significant amounts of capital. Being a technology business, we had a burn, right? We were spending money every month to grow and build our market share. And rather than continue to dilute our business as a private company, we believed there was an opportunity to partner up with a business that, like Tilt, which was able to generate real revenue and significant profits from the plant touching side of the business, growing and selling cannabis, and use that to offset some of our burn, and together raise capital, go public, and really fund this big, broad vision.
Righto. So what were the component elements of that? You brought to the table the kind of the CRM component, the technology component. What were the other components that the Tilt people pulled together?
Yeah, so there's plant-touching assets, cultivation, growing, processing, manufacturing of cannabis products, retail in a couple different states, as well as a hardware component. We ended up acquiring a company called Jupiter Research, which manufactures a lot of the vape pens that are sold, white label hardware manufacturer. And then Blackbird, another software and distribution business that does transportation and distribution of wholesale cannabis, throughout California and Nevada. Those are the sort of the core components.
Right. So the thought, I guess, was to kind of bring, I don't want to say a fully vertical orientation to the table, but represent many of the supply chain elements and take them all public at one time under the name Tilt, correct?
Exactly. Yep.
Right. So, okay. So tell us a little bit about what the early results looked like and how have things been going in the last 12 months?
Sure. So when we went public in December of 2018, it really was sort of the peak of the market. And so we came out at a really challenging time. I think the market's been down quite significantly, basically ever since the day we went out. And so, out of the gate, our vision required additional capital. And I think that became pretty challenging pretty quickly. And so really most of 2019 was spent playing defense as opposed to playing offense. And I think, you talk about, speaking about the broader market in general, I think one of the main themes has been that lack of capital, at least throughout 2019, that's starting to change now. So, for us, I think we had to make some adjustments on the fly. We made some changes at senior management, putting in place, a CEO and a COO who were entrepreneurs and very operational, as opposed to more of the sort of banking and finance team, and really leveraging that to kind of help refocus the vision and maybe recognize that we couldn't do all the things we were originally planning to do, and we needed to get a little bit more focused.
Righto. So earlier in the show, we talked about a number of CEOs that were removed from their positions because of the same kinds of challenges you guys face, which was kind of a market that had a lack of capital, some predicted forecasts that weren't delivered against, and just an overall kind of a challenge from that perspective. Replacing these individuals oftentimes were the private equity folks that had invested heavily in the business, putting people in place that had more of a financial orientation with an eye toward kind of squeezing more volume and more profit, really more profit out of the business. That seems to have been a trend. And what's your reaction to the success of that trend?
I would say we were ahead of the curve. We're seeing a lot of these CEO changes in the last couple of weeks or months. Ours was almost a year ago. And so while we were one of the first companies to probably struggle publicly, we also like to think we're one of the first companies to turn the corner and start to come out on the other side. So, with the new management team, we've been able to cut costs, really focus on, driving towards profitability while continuing to grow the business. And that's been pretty successful, coupled with, again, scaling back our vision, focusing more on the ancillary side of the business, the products and services, the technology and innovation, as opposed to the cultivation side. And so as we shift our focuses there, stay lean and drive towards profitability, from a financial standpoint, we've had a lot more success.
Okay, let's talk about some other public companies, if you would, please. If you could give us, just kind of my audience is always interested in understanding the investment, how they should manage their investment portfolio, the percent that should go into healthcare, and within that, the percent that should go into cannabis. Some people think cannabis is healthcare. Others think of it more as a kind of almost like a competitor to spirits, if you will, more the adult use side. What are your thoughts on the publicly traded firms today? Who are the players that you think are winning and losing?
Sure. Well, I think you have to separate Canada from the United States. And when I say Canada, I don't mean trading on a Canadian exchange. I mean the Canadian companies that trade on the U.S. exchange, as opposed to the U.S. companies that trade on a Canadian exchange. But early on, you had the Canopies, the Afrias, the Auroras. Those were the sort of Canadian operators who were, able to list on a U.S. major exchange because they didn't operate here. And again, we've seen those valuations come way down. We see some nice turnaround now in terms of, Canopy just posted some solid revenue for the past quarter. But historically, these businesses are burning tremendous amounts of capital, tens of millions, even $100 million a quarter of capital expenditure, and they've raised billions. And clearly they need to move beyond Canada, right? 35 million people, not enough to sustain that business. And they talk about international markets, South America, Latin America, Europe, and eventually one day the United States, some of them starting to dip their toes into the U.S. CBD market. So it'll be interesting to see how those Canadian guys deploy the capital that they've been able to amass. Conversely, you have the U.S. companies, you have sort of the MSOs, right, the multi-state operators. You have your Crescos and GTIs and MedMens and Curaleafs, and they're now finally able to start to raise some real money again after a tough 2019. We've seen a couple big, $200-300 million raises from Curaleaf and Cresco just recently, which is a great sign for the market. These guys have a tremendous advantage in the United States, and it'll be interesting to see how they play with the Canadian guys as the market unfolds. A while ago, if you'll recall, we saw Acreage announce a deal where Canopy was going to pre-buy them, or announce a deal where they were going to work together. So I think that'll really be the interesting dynamic that'll unfold here over the next year or two, is what happens at a federal level and how these U.S. operating companies that currently trade on the CSE will be able to access institutional capital or a more major exchange.
Right out. So, you mentioned Cresco, MedMen, Curaleaf, and others. We talked a little bit about MedMen earlier. They just recently, once again, changed their management team. They were a must-have MSO investment in the early days, right? Pretty much everybody that got into the space that was thinking dispensaries got involved with MedMen in the early days. They crested some time ago and have had nothing but problems since. Do you have a point of view on what the challenge has been with MedMen?
I think part of it is you have to be able to get towards profitability. And I think if you look at their earnings, the amount of capital it costs them to run their business, that's really the theme here we're seeing is, money is no longer infinite in the market. People want to see results, not just tell me the story. I think California has been a more challenging market than people thought, right? Obviously, it's huge, and everyone, thought that was the epicenter of cannabis, and it probably is, but there was a pretty challenging conversion as it went from medical to adult use. I think there's been some challenges with, taxation and, some of the operations there. And this notion of, partial ownership in multiple stores has certainly proved difficult. But, I think if you look at, for your people who are, looking at the stocks, I think, look at companies that have that, either path towards profitability or something, a differentiating factor, something that allows them to build a moat and continue to be successful in the United States as the market continues to unfold.
Right. And if you had to put a name on one or two of those companies, who would they be?
Well, it's interesting. So we're starting to see consolidation, right? And I think that's going to be the future of the U.S. side. We saw some with Tilt already. We saw Cresco with the Origin House, and we saw, Curaleaf just buying Select, which is interesting because that's, your MSO retail store that's now buying a brand. So, the analogy is a little interesting when you start to talk about spirits or the CPG world, when you now have someone that owns and operates stores as well as, is buying up brands that are sold elsewhere. So I think consolidation is interesting. Again, I would look at companies that have a solid balance sheet and something differentiating about them. But if you look at those two acquisitions, they've also changed pretty significantly. Both when the Select deal was announced and the Cresco Origin House deal was announced, a lot changed between when those deals were first announced and then what they ended up closing at, just as the market continued to shift. So this is very much an industry you have to keep a pretty regular eye on.
All right, so let's move away from that for a minute, and let's your thoughts on private companies. Where do you think the investment focus ought to be? Do you think it is, people can follow the public markets? It's more liquid, obviously. I myself do not invest in publicly traded stocks. I only invest in pre-public stocks. What is your thought on that?
So again, I think you follow the theme of consolidation. I mean, you're a brand guy, right? CPGs, your wheelhouse. I think if you look at the brands that are being started now, you have to ask yourself, how much scale can they get, and will they be, an attractive acquisition? Because, the same way most spirits are owned by, one of the Diageos or other, big boys. Not that it's a perfect parallel, but I do think you have to imagine there'll be some consolidation at the brand space. On the retail side, again, as it's such a state by state conversation that you really have to think about the state that you're investing in. Right now in Massachusetts, cannabis is selling at $4,000 a pound. That's, it's less than $1,000 in a state like Colorado that's more mature. So the question is, how much runway does a business have in a market before licenses open up? Because eventually, this notion of a limited license market, I think, does evolve. I think, all things find homeostasis or equilibrium and, kind of meet in the middle as the pendulum swings back. So if you're making an investment on the private side, I guess the question is, what's your exit strategy? Is it to go public as a standalone company, or is it a business that's going to be a fit as we see consolidation? And will it be with one of the current, U.S. guys that's trading on the CSE, or will they hold on long enough until federal legislation changes and they're either acquired by a Canadian company or a, real world CPG company?
Righto. So let's take a look at your point about Massachusetts, because it's an interesting one. I believe there's like 36 or 40 dispensaries only, adult use dispensaries currently, and there's a few more that have been slated for opening in the near future, which I think is the fundamental essence of the $4,000 per pound sale, along with the fact that you've got Massachusetts, you've got New York and other states that are close in the New England area that are not adult use. So it's a supply-demand play. Would you agree with that? Is that what you mean by numbers of locations and that sort of thing? And how does that compare to California, if you would, please?
Yeah. So you know which state has the most dispensary licenses?
I think it's California, is it not?
Oklahoma has 2,273 cannabis licenses.
All right, well, there you go. That's a gotcha, ladies and gentlemen. Okay.
It sure is. And the reason is because the way the legislation was written is they just open it up, and there's basically no artificial cap. Massachusetts took the opposite approach, right? We're talking first single digit and then double digit number of stores they were allowed to open. Colorado was the first one. I think it's now just under 800 or so that are, I believe, up and running. California has actually shrunk a little bit because when it went from medical to adult use, there was a lot of guys that didn't quite make the transition. And I think we went from a couple thousand sort of medical dispensaries, which then became gray market dispensaries just in the LA region alone, to just a few hundred. And so that's been part of the challenge there, is these brands that were selling to the broad medical market where almost anyone in the state could purchase them. Now, again, that number's consolidated quite significantly. So, again, it's a fine balance if you're a state, right? You don't want to limit the number of stores too much where people can't find one, or there's a long line, or it's prohibitively expensive. But, as we saw in Oregon for a while, right, when there were so many stores, these guys couldn't make any money. Everyone was selling similar products, and it was a race to the bottom, and a lot of guys, lost their businesses. And so I think finding that sweet spot is what we'll see. It's just a question of how long it takes to get there.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about California. I mentioned that earlier in the show as well. It's about a $2.5 billion public market, adult use, I'll use the term legal market. And that market is probably 4 times as large on the gray market side, right? What I'll call the illegal side. Mm-hmm. Compare that to Colorado, where it's pretty much upside down. So about 80% of the business is done in the legal market and roughly about 20% done in the illegal market. What is your thought on why that is the case?
So keep in mind, California was really one of the first states to have legal medical cannabis, and it became quite easy to get, right? I joke, getting your medical card in California was like filling out a multiple choice test, but there were no wrong answers, right? It was just pick one. Here's a sheet of potential ailments. Which one do you have? And as a result, everyone opened their businesses. They were not highly regulated. There was, non-retail storefront, kind of delivery-only businesses. And I mentioned there were several thousand just in LA alone, right? And, they were sort of gray market. They were not technically breaking, the state law, but it was pretty vague. But it was a healthy business, and everyone was shopping there, and they were all saturated with brands. Well, eventually they decided to vote for adult use, which was great, and sort of remove that gray area. But what happened was, there was a process where you had to go through all these applications and then start paying taxes. And now you had these businesses that were, following the rule of the law, who were being undercut by these gray market guys who weren't charging 30% excise taxes, right, or paying all these other exorbitant fees. And so the legal stores were really struggling. And it took a little while, and then finally California actually cracked down on those gray market medical stores. And that's why we saw the number of dispensaries in California go from several thousand to several hundred. And when that happened, everyone's favorite neighborhood retail store or delivery guy basically got shut down. And so now you have a limited number of stores. Some markets don't allow them at all, right? Certain municipalities ban delivery or ban retail or both. And there's also taxes, 25, 30%. And so a product that used to be very affordable is now quite expensive. And, you have this culture of paying what you're used to. It was harder to adjust. Whereas Colorado did things the other way, right? When they opened up they had a very more strict medical market. And when they opened up adult use, they made it a lot more accessible. And it was a much more successful transition.
Right. And what about the tax structure in Colorado versus the tax structure in California? Have they been more reasonable with the Colorado tax Colorado tax surcharge?
Yeah, it is. And again, it's also a matter of expectations, right? People have been growing and selling cannabis in California for a very long time. And I think there's just this expectation of what it can and should cost. And so it just has to do with, I think a lot of it has to do with expectations and what you're used to.
I would agree with that. I think, as we talk about all these other states coming online, and, in the Northeast, obviously that means New Jersey, that means Connecticut, and others that are thinking about becoming adult use. Do you have a point of view on why the Colorado model is not just replicated in these states, yet why there's so much focus on doing it differently, state by state?
Well, I think everyone likes to think they have it figured out. I think politicians love to put their name on things, and each states believe that they know what's best for their market. I do think Colorado was a pretty successful rollout. Now, granted, it was the first one, and so you would think that things would have gotten a lot better since then. But I think if you look at some of the other markets that have transitioned to adult use, you'll see that it's pretty challenging. So I definitely give Colorado a lot of credit, and I think people are looking to them to see what worked and what didn't. But it's hard, and it's also hard when in certain states you have really different views on cannabis by region. Take New York, for example. Manhattan is very, very different than Rochester in their views, both politically and on issues like cannabis. And even look at Long Island. All the different municipalities in Long Island have different stances on whether or not they want cannabis. So I think it's challenging. And if you're a politician dealing with different viewpoints across your state, you want to take all that into consideration and try to get a little creative. But sometimes keep it simple is a good solution.
Yeah. I mean, the case we've made here countless times is start with the Colorado model, and then just tweak it a little bit to address the fundamental issues that you've mentioned, as opposed to kind of starting in a very different place, which seems to be the case in many of these states. All right. Before you leave us, if you could please share with us what your current role is and how you see the short-term future for Tilt, please.
Sure. So my current role is now business development. And I think, everything we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, smaller companies struggling to access capital, consolidation, I think there's a lot of opportunity right now. We're seeing good businesses have to shut down or cut costs just because they can't raise a little bit of capital. And one of the things that I find very exciting is, at Tilt, we reach over 2,000 brands and retailers across the country. We provide them with the hardware they need for their vape pens. We provide them with the software they need for their retail stores. We provide them with the wholesale transportation and distribution for their products. And so we're very integrated into the supply chain. We don't look at the different MSOs that are out there, the names that I mentioned, as our competitors. They're our clients. We provide them with the services and products that they need. And so there's an opportunity for consolidation on that ancillary side of the business where, companies that maybe aren't profitable could be at scale, and we have that scale. And so one of the things I'm really focused on now is capitalizing on this market and recognizing that a challenging market conditions leads to opportunities. And so thinking about other ways we can work with, acquire, or partner companies that are maybe struggling and, try to build an even stronger foundation for the future here. So, again, with challenge comes opportunity. So, we're, like I said, turning a corner and excited about the future.
All right, listen, Joel, why don't you I always like to end the interviews with final thoughts. So you've got, any number of folks listening to you right now. What would you like to say to them before we close?
I think the cannabis market, particularly the U.S. guys, is very retail focused because, again, a lot of these institutional investors can't get into the space. And I think as a result, there's a lot of day-to-day questioning and pressure. But this is still early-ish days of an industry. I think there's a lot of room ahead, and it's really hard to measure companies, not to mention 90-day increments, but day-to-day or hour-to-hour. So again, if you're looking at businesses, pick ones that you like. Find companies with strong balance sheets. Find ones that are unique, that you believe in their vision. But I think day trading, a really volatile industry, can be challenging. So I'd say don't forget to stick to fundamentals, whether it's the regular real world or the cannabis world.
I would agree. I think that's good thinking. All right, Joel, I want to thank you for your time today and hope to have you back on the show sometime down the road. I appreciate it, and all the best to you guys at Tilt.
Thank you so much. Great to be back.
When we come back, we'll move to the fourth segment of our show, Your Messages.
Are you waking up the day after a workout, tennis match, or even a long walk just feeling it? Introducing CBDeliveryNY.com to help you live the life you know you can. They carry superior CBD made from the highest quality hemp, grown and harvested under the strictest regulations. Their sales force, certified trainers, physical therapists, and yoga teachers, all of whom have gone through rigorous education, helping them to understand what the power of plants can do for your overall wellness. So start 2020 off right. Try one of their New Year's product bundles. Go to CBDeliveryNY.com. That's CBDeliveryNY.com to find out what the power of plants can do for you.
Welcome back to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill right here on 710 WOR Radio every Sunday at 8 a.m. Don't forget I write a blog, medium.com/@JeffreyHill2. That's medium.com/@JeffreyHill2. Now let's move on to the fourth segment of our show, responding to your messages. Our letter today is from Nate from Morristown, New Jersey. Nate says, my son plays high school football and hockey. His older brother plays college ball in Massachusetts. They both deal with tremendous contact sports and constantly complain of aches and pains after games, especially the day after. My older son has good experience with CBD and cannabis in dealing with inflammation, recovery, and sleep, he said. I've been afraid of this solution all my life, yet my younger son is using CBD for inflammation after games and wants to use cannabis to help him sleep. What are your thoughts? Well, Nate, you've heard our discussion last week, which confirmed that two major sports, the NHL and Major League Baseball, have softened their position on cannabis use, and many athletes are using successfully. You've also heard from at least six ex-pro athletes who have gotten real value from using the plant medicinally. My suggestion, since you live in New Jersey, is to go see a doctor who understands cannabis, get your son a prescription, and monitor his progress. The evidence continues to show that this issue helps with a number of indications, like inflammation, pain management, and sleep, that many are experiencing and having reasonable success. Again, our suggestion is get yourself a script, try it out, and see if indeed you can get similar results. All right. I hope you enjoyed today's show and our guest, Joel Milton of Tilt. We'll be back next week for another 60 minutes of the critical issues facing cannabis and CBD. We'll address the financial implications, the political implications, and, of course, the societal implications. Remember, knowledge is built brick by brick. Today you get my 41st brick, as amazing as that sounds. Until next week, this is NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill.